All right, welcome back. So module 4 is going to focus on what to eat. Now remember the beauty of the program is that we don't have to be zealots, so to speak. I don't know if you've heard that term, a nutrition zealot. A nutrition zealot, somebody who thinks that I don't know, because of this holier way of eating, that they're better than somebody. They count every gram of fat that goes into their mouth. If you consume gluten, you're going to get inflamed. All those things. One, that's never successful. And this program doesn't require that, but you do have to have a basic understanding of certain things about the food that you eat. And so that's kind of the idea of this module. So first thing that we need to identify is the term macronutrient. When we talk about macronutrients, we're talking about foods that need to be ingested in copious quantities. So our macronutrients are our carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Now, when we talk about these macronutrients, we're going to talk about carbs and fat kind of together and then separate protein and discuss it separately. And the reason behind that is our body treats protein a little bit differently. We have a place to store carbs. We store carbs in our skeletal muscle and in the liver. We have a place to store fats. We store our fats in our adipose tissue. We don't store proteins though. We use proteins for body structures. And then if we don't need the excess protein, we excrete it. And so it's kind of different. It's extremely vital for weight loss, but we're going to hold off on talking about proteins until the end of this module. So let's talk about the other two. One, carbs don't make you fat. They just don't do it. Um, I mean, some people will say, well, I'm sensitive to carbs. That is a make believe term. There's no such thing as being sensitive to carbohydrates. Let's discuss why people may think this and show you some data that shows the opposite. So one, what happens to carbohydrates when we ingest them in surplus? There's three things that happen. One, we simply store them. I often will ask my university students, okay, how do we store carbs? And everyone's like, we store them as fat. No, we don't store carbs as fat. We store carbs as, we call it glycogen. I'm just going to use the word carb from here on out, but we store as glycogen in the skeletal muscle and in the liver. This is one of the reasons that it's very important to exercise, because if you exercise, you increase the ability to store more carbs in your muscle. We'll get to why that's so important here in the next few chapters. So we store them as glycogen, not fat. And there's nothing wrong with that. When we store it as glycogen, we need it for energy. That's good. The second thing is we simply use it for energy. Okay, again, that's not fat. After those first two things, yeah, we can convert some of it to fat, and we will look at that. But that's after the first two things. So excess carbohydrates, we already said it, storing it in muscle and liver. But you want to think of your muscle kind of like the body's gas tank for carbohydrates. And the thing is that you need to know it's not as if the gas tank is always filling. Meaning, if you eat breakfast, say I eat oatmeal for breakfast or something, and I fill up that gas tank with carbs, my muscle, say 80% of the way. Well, if I don't eat again for 2 or 3 hours, I'm using those carbs for energy. And so it starts to deplete. And so when I eat carbs again, it's just filling up the gas tank a little bit more, but it's not spilling over. It's not full. The beauty of exercise is you deplete, you empty the gas tank. So then when you eat carbohydrates, you're just putting those carbs back in the gas tank because it was empty. And so excess carbs, we store them. Now, let's say that we fill our storage. Now, what do we do? The second thing that I had said is we do increase the use of carbohydrate for energy. We call that carbohydrate oxidation. This was a landmark study. What they did is they took individuals and they gave them 300 grams of carbs, and that's what we call maintenance. So when they gave them 300 grams of carbs, it wasn't too much, it wasn't too little. So what they took in, and then here's carbohydrate utilization, so what they used for energy, it was essentially matched. But then after that, they said, okay, now let's increase the amount of carbs all the way up to 450 grams. That's a lot. And let's see what happens with carbs when we increase the amount of carbs that we give somebody. All this gray area is storage. Now, remember, we don't store carbs as fat. So meaning one, we store a lot of it as glycogen that we said. But if you look at the utilization line, that goes up, meaning we use it to generate energy. When we eat a lot of carbs, we store them and then we burn them. The reason that people say, oh, carbs may be fat is, let's say pizza. Let's say I stuff my face with a full large pizza, just me, high carb, high fat. All of those carbohydrates are either being stored as glycogen or burned for energy. But what about the fat? Now, same researcher, same figure, they did the same thing and they also increased fat though. So now they had a couple days of maintenance where they gave them a certain amount of fat that wasn't too much, too little, and they measured fat utilization and it was the same. Then they increased fat consumption. So they said, okay, now let's increase fat intake. And what happened to utilization? Now, they were eating carbs at the same time. So they were eating a diet that was high fat, high carbs. Utilization went down, meaning they didn't burn as much fat. And the thing that's much different about fat storage and the carb storage, where do we store fat? We store it in our fat. All of this is fat creation. So what this means is I eat my pizza and all of the carbs in the pizza I'm burning for energy. All of the fat in that pizza, because the carbs are being burned for energy, I don't need the fat for energy. It's all being stored. And what do I say? I'm like, oh, carbs made me fat. No, you eating a whole pizza made you fat. So first thing that happens with carbs when we overeat them, we just burn more carbs. Second thing is we store them as glycogen. But then, yeah, we can convert some to fat. Let's look at this. This is a process called de novo lipogenesis. This was originally discovered in swine, in farm animals in the 1800s. And what do pigs eat? They eat grains. And what they found is, oh my goodness, these pigs eat lots of grains and they convert a lot of those grains to fat. Luckily, we're not pigs. They started to do research on humans and they said, oh, wait, humans don't really do this that much. Let me give you an example. In this study, they took individuals and they said, okay, we're going to give them the amount of calories that they need for maintenance. That was about 2,700 calories. That was maintenance. They didn't gain weight. They didn't lose weight. And then they said, now they did a lot of things in this study. I'm not caring about any of this stuff for our purposes. Okay. And then they said, let's add. So they measured this maintenance and then they added 50% of carbohydrate intake. So they went from 324 grams to 684 grams of carbs. That's a ton of carbs. That's about 3,000 calories of just carbohydrates. Note how much that is. 3,000 calories of just carbs. So they went extremely excessive. And then they wanted to know, out of the 684 grams that I gave this person, way more than they needed, how many turned to fat? There's a few different ways to measure this, but essentially what they found is only 9 grams turned to fat. Now, I don't want any grams turning to fat, but I'm trying to make the point. 9 grams is 81 calories. They had 3,000 calories of carbohydrates that they consumed on this day, way more than what they needed. And only 81 turned to fat. To put this in perspective, to be able to gain, based off this study, gaining a pound of fat through this pathway, they would have had to eat this way for 44 days to gain 1 pound of fat. Don't misunderstand me. They probably would have gained more weight because they're gaining than that, because they're eating a ton. But I'm saying to gain a pound of fat only from this process of converting it from carbs, they'd have to eat this way for 44 days. That's not what our body wants to do. Our body doesn't want to. It's not efficient at taking carbohydrates and making them fat. It can. We showed you here, but that's not what it wants to do. It wants to use it for energy. So again, why the scare that carbs are supposedly will make you fat? Well, look what happened to our country. What we're looking here on the left is our macronutrient intake, so carbs and protein, between the 70s and the year 2000. We're looking, this also shows gender differences. Don't worry about differences between men and women. There really aren't any. So I'll just highlight the dark line. Okay. So if we look at fat intake, it stays the same. Looks like it ticks down a little bit in men, ticks up a little bit in women. Essentially, it stays the same. But if we look here, carbohydrate intake increased in the 80s. It increased dramatically. Well, that correlates with obesity rates going up dramatically in the 80s. Again, we have this correlation that we tend to call causation. So at this time period in our country, the heart healthy diet was a diet that was low fat. So everybody was saying, oh, remove fat, remove fat, remove fat. Well, what was introduced to the market? My favorite candy is Twizzlers. And I feel really healthy eating Twizzlers because on the bottom right-hand corner of that bag of Twizzlers, it says fat-free, 0 grams of fat. No fat in those Twizzlers. So man, I'm just going to eat that Twizzlers like crazy. You see, that's what had happened because, and obviously I'm being facetious about Twizzlers being healthy for you, but because a low-fat diet was marketed as the healthy diet, well, food that is total junk food puts 0 grams of fat on there, and then people feel like they're being healthy. The advice for Americans during this time period was to remove fat. The advice was not to increase carbohydrate. It was to remove fat. Well, what did they do? Average fat content stayed exactly the same, and they just increased carbs. To put it another way, they just ate more calories. They just ate more calories. And so they gained weight. The other thing to note is, what did we just say? When you have a high carb, high fat diet, that's a perfect storm for weight or for fat storage. You burn all the carbs, you store all the fat. And so this is what had happened. But people like Dr. Atkins and all these guys, they've come out and they've said, oh, it's because carbs made you fat. Well, we did eat too much. That's true. But if we would have decreased fat like we were told to, we wouldn't have seen this. But that's not what happened. And so that's where we've gotten to this scare. That's all this slide says. But if you look at the data specific to carbs, it doesn't make you fat. And so this is interesting. All of these acronyms are acronyms of big national research studies, meaning each one of those acronyms is a study that covered thousands of individuals. I mean, like 30,000, 40,000, depending on the study you're looking at. So this is a big review paper. On the X, and I apologize when I formatted this, I cut it out. It says the percent of calories coming from carbs. That's the X-axis, percent of calories coming from carbs. On the Y is BMI. Look at this trend. The trend is that as percent of calories coming from carbs goes up, average BMI is actually lower. A correlation between two things does not establish causation. I've made that clear. But if there's not a correlation, how can there be causation? Meaning we don't even have data that correlates saying that diets that are higher in carbs increases weight gain. We don't have that data. That's not even there. Please don't interpret this to say, therefore, just by eating more carbs, you'll lose weight. That's not what I'm saying, and I don't believe that. That's not what this says. What this is just saying is people that have a higher percentage of their diet coming from carbohydrates tend to have lower BMIs. That's what the data says. So I show this to you, not that this diet is all about removing carbs or increasing carbs. And actually, the diet doesn't really focus so much on the amount of grams from carbs or fats. I show this to you so that you're not fearful of eating some carbohydrates. This is a big deal because I have never met somebody, Zach, I'm 5 years and I've not had carbohydrate. Have you met somebody like that? 10 years, I've never put a piece of bread in my mouth. I've never met someone like that. It's not sustainable to do this. And so it's important for me to make it clear that you don't have to. Now, some of the other things, I guess they're kind of dieting taboos that have kind of gotten thrown in here that you don't need to be fearful of. The other one is gluten. Gluten is found within carbohydrate foods. Gluten, this is a YouTube link. I can't show it because I'm broadcasting this through Zoom and it makes it fuzzy. But it's hilarious. If you go to YouTube and just type in Jimmy Kimmel gluten, he goes around the streets of LA and he asks people, are you gluten-free? And of course they're like, yes, I am. I'm so much better than everybody else. And he says, what is gluten? And not one of these people who won't touch it has any clue what it is. It's hilarious. And don't get me wrong, there's obviously reasons to remove gluten: celiac disease, if you have a wheat allergy or gluten intolerance. Yes, if you have those, you need to remove gluten. But the number one reason that people remove gluten is not from one of those reasons. It's because they think it's healthier. People think it'll cure autism, give you better skin. There's a lot of reasons that people think that it will do this. And some people think it aids in weight loss, and there's no data for this. Actually, if you look at the data, if you take people with celiac disease, and that's what this study is doing, if you take people with celiac disease and they have to remove gluten, they have an autoimmune issue and it inflames their GI system, so they remove it. But if you take these individuals and they remove gluten, they all gain weight. They all gain weight. They remove gluten and they all gain weight. Now, the reason behind their weight gain is not a bad reason. The reason behind it is because now they've healed their gastrointestinal system, their small intestine, and they're absorbing nutrients. But my point of showing this is it's not like these people who remove gluten are losing weight. No, they all gain weight. If we look at the general population, there's no published report showing that a gluten-free diet produces weight loss. I mean, that it's just not there. And so don't worry about gluten. I mean, unless you have celiacs, a wheat allergy, or if you have a gluten sensitivity. But if that's not you, then don't worry about it. So then what is the ideal macronutrient percentage? There's not one. What I'm actually going to do, though, is I am going to stop this video right now and then pick this up in part 2 of this module. So please watch part 2.